Hi. My name is Rachel Mendel, and it's wonderful to sort of see you out there tonight. I will keep this brief because we have some great readings in store, but there are many important people to thank for this year's festival. In fact, if I listed them all by name, we'd be here forever. I have to start by thanking all of our attendees for supporting the festival with their presence and enthusiasm. You're an incredible community. Thank you. Thank you to our book fair exhibitors and our festival authors. So much talent. You've been so wildly generous with your time. Thank you to the Montana Book Festival Board, Garth Whitson, Barbara Theroux, John Reimel, Honor Bray, and Eamon Fahey. Thanks to, yes, give them some applause. Design of Susie Reard and the art of Max Mon. I have wonderful people working with me this year, the unstoppable Cindy Gilbert and the joyous Jordan Chestnut. This wouldn't have happened without them. Thank you to the organizers of our youth festival, Dana McMurray and Pam Carlton. A very special thanks to Humanities Montana and Kim Anderson for this incredible legacy. Humanities Montana has contributed so much to this year's festival. My thanks also to Sarah Kahn and Freeverse. Giant thanks to our festival partners, the Montana Department of Commerce, the bookstore at UM, Fact and Fiction, the MAM, Shakespeare and Company, and the Missoula Public Library. We are also very grateful to the following sponsors: Submittable, the Wilma, Good Food Store, MCAT, the Montana Arts Council, Montgomery Distillery, the Pleiades Foundation, UM's Creative Writing Program, Black Coffee, Barnes & Noble, Big Sky Film Institute, Les Petites Autres, Montana Public Radio, Mountain Press, the University of Montana Press, Dana Gallery, E3 Convergence Gallery, Noteworthy, Radius, Zootown Brew, and to Bracha and Danny Tannenbaum. Thanks to the fantastic Missoula businesses who offered discounts to our button holders this year. This festival is the product of collaboration with many organizations already doing incredible things, including Tell Us Something. Thank you to Mark Moss. Yeah. The Big Sky Documentary Film Festival. Thank you to Geeta Saeed Kelly. Pie and Whiskey. Thank you, Sam Lagan and Kate Lebo. The Helena Area Literary Arts Organization. Thank you to Chelsea Rice, who also just gave me this dress. Thank you, Chelsea Rice. Our volunteers this year are out of sight. They are the backbone of this event. They are our biggest asset. Let's give them a giant round of applause. For tonight's event, Stephanie Land will introduce Leigh Stein, Rachel Richardson will introduce Shobha Rao, and Sarah Aswell will introduce Maile Meloy. Without further ado, Stephanie Land.
I had a moment of panic on Thursday morning when I got into my truck to take my kid to daycare. I didn't panic because of the evidence that someone had gone through my glove compartment and laughably found nothing to take. It was that, in a mere 24 hours, I'd pick up Leigh Stein to drive us to a workshop we'd spend the next 90 minutes teaching. I didn't panic because I didn't feel prepared or that I was nervous about meeting Leigh, though that was definitely part of it. I panicked because my truck, this lifted 1987 Toyota 4Runner, is absolutely full of car seats, dog hair, dust, and half-eaten slices of pizza. The entire back of it is packed with things that I have meant to donate for 3 months. And I thought, Lee's from the East Coast. She'll probably be dressed like nice, and I can't pick her up in this dirty jalopy. I felt I needed to honor and respect what a pivotal person Leigh has been in my writing career. In May of 2014, a Facebook group called Binders Full of Women Writers began. It's a bit like Fight Club and very secret. I asked her permission to speak about it tonight, and currently contains somewhere around, I'm guessing, 40,000 members. From this, Leigh started a nonprofit called Out of the Binders, and she organizes an event called BinderCon, which happens twice a year in LA and New York. In her opening remarks for BinderCon LA last spring, Leigh used me, like said my name and talked about me, in her opening remarks as an example of why Binders exists and what it can do to launch writing careers. And it's true, because of the Binders that I met, who I now think of as a cohort. For the last year, I've been able to support myself and my 2 daughters purely off of writing. And earlier this summer, sold my first book on proposal. Thanks. Leigh's tireless efforts in lifting the voices of women writers through the work that she does have earned her the title of leading feminist by the Washington Post, and she's been honored as a woman of influence by the New York Business Journal. I watch daily Binders lifting each other up, succeeding, and living the life that they have dreamed of as a journalist, a freelancer, a screenwriter, an essayist, a sports writer, fiction writer, comedic writer, novelist, and poet. We overcome our fears together in sharing our stories, followed by the vulnerability hangovers, and through imposter syndromes in pitching our dream publications. And Leigh watches that, and she helps and she guides where she can. So I cleaned my truck, and probably didn't need to. Leigh is compassionate, open, and through our workshop, I saw her in action, passionately helping women's voices be heard. Please welcome me in joining Leigh Stein.
Thank you so much. Now my next dream is that someday I get to introduce Stephanie when her book comes out. That'll be really good. Thank you so much, Rachel and Stephanie, for conspiring to get me here. I came from Connecticut, which was a long journey, but I love Missoula, and I've been texting my boyfriend all day, like, we're moving here. I'm like taking photos of the river and sending it to him. This is like such a great town. You guys are really lucky. So I'm going to read a scene from my new memoir called Land of Enchantment. It's set in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Land of Enchantment. And this is a book about something that's happening to a lot of young people. It happened to me. I was in an abusive relationship in my early 20s. And I think a misunderstanding about abusive relationships is that the abuser is some kind of obvious monster that you would know to stay away from. But in reality, my ex-boyfriend was extremely charming, charismatic, handsome. I didn't even know I was in an abusive relationship. I thought it was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to me. And when I finally felt strong enough to stop answering his phone calls in 2011, 5 weeks later, he had stabbed another man in a gas station parking lot, and a week after that, he died in a motorcycle accident. So the book is about our relationship, but it's also about the experience of being a young person and having someone die before the rest of your peers have had to go through this milestone. It feels very isolating. So Jason and I lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I wrote my first novel, but I'm going to read a scene from before we moved. We met, very ironically, at an audition for Medea. So there was a lot of tragedy and high stakes from the very beginning. So we met in Illinois. So this is when we're in Illinois. I was 22, he was 19. He looked like James Dean. The proposal. A couple of months before Jason and I moved to Albuquerque, when we were still living in suburban Chicagoland, we went to a Memorial Day weekend party he'd heard about through a friend of a friend. At 1 a.m, we knocked on the door, and a giddy blonde girl answered and told us she'd been doing Jaeger bombs with her mom who is now passed out upstairs. Then she walked away. Thanks to the sleepovers of my childhood, this house was the kind of suburban, split-level ranch I knew how to navigate without ever having been there before. We walked through the dining room and kitchen and let ourselves out onto the concrete patio in the back. The night was humid, heavy with the hum of air conditioning units. Jason took a shot and opened a beer. I stood by sober. Before the party, we'd gotten into a fight and I'd tried to break up with him. He suggested I stop drinking because it made me too emotional. Within a few minutes of our arrival, the doorbell rang. A gangly boy peeked over the privacy fence and saw cop cars parked out front. Everyone at the party was underage except for me and, presumably, the girl's mom. There was knocking on the door. There was nowhere to run. The fence was too high. The blonde became hysterical and said we should all hide in her basement. "And you think that will make them go away?" Jason said. He swallowed the last of his beer and said he would answer the door. The more the blonde begged him not to, the more revved up he got. I followed the two of them into the house and then stood off to the side as Jason opened the door for the two police officers standing on the front porch. "This your party?" "No, sir," Jason said and pointed at the girl. "Are your parents home?" "No," she said gravely. "Better call them then," the cop said. For the next 2 hours, everyone had to take a breathalyzer and decide whether to call their parents and tell them what had happened or spend the night in jail. A teenage boy and I were the only sober ones. We sat at the dining room table quietly while everyone else took the test and called their parents. The blonde kept her cell phone to her ear and insisted that her mom wasn't home. No, she didn't know when she'd be back. We'd find out later that her mom was coaching her by phone from the bedroom to say she wasn't home so she wouldn't be arrested for serving alcohol to kids. I wasn't allowed to get up from the table and go talk to Jason, who was waiting in line to be breathalyzed, but I knew he wouldn't want to call his dad, and I didn't want him to sleep in jail. So when it came time for his turn, I stood up and asked if they would let me take him home, since I was 22, sober, and we were living together, loosely defined by my sleeping over at his one-bedroom apartment every night. "I'll take responsibility for him," I said. "What are you?" the cop sneered. "His mom or his girlfriend? If you were his wife, I might say yes." I felt belittled and frustrated, but before I could think of anything feisty to say in return, Jason dropped to one knee. He took off the ring he always wore, a plain band soldered from a motorcycle part, and asked if I would marry him. I laughed and said yes. He put the ring on my finger. Both cops gave a slow clap. I touched the ring, felt how warm the band was from being close to his skin. I spun it in a loop around my finger. I knew I would have to give it back, but I wouldn't have wanted to keep it anyway. The ring had been a gift from his first girlfriend's dad, a motorcycle mechanic who'd made them a matching set. It was too big for any of my fingers. "Sorry," one of the cops said, "but we're still going to have to take you in," and made Jason turn around while he put the handcuffs on. Jason was all yes, sir, no, sir. I was all out of ideas. They hadn't put the cuffs on anyone else, but all the other kids had called their parents. At last, after all the kids were sobered and gone, they let Jason go. The whole thing had been a show for a scare. They said we could go, and we had to say thank you. I still had the ring. In the car, I gave it back. We stayed up the rest of the night, driving, smoking, talking, replaying the scene, what everyone's faces had looked like, how brilliant we were, until it turned from night to day and McDonald's started serving breakfast. This was the story I told his family in his grandmother's living room the night before his funeral. When I arrived at the part where he gets down on one knee, everyone laughed. They could picture the scene. For a brief moment, I'd brought him back to life. Then his mom passed around a Ziploc bag of the things found on his body at the scene of the accident. A wallet with a $1 in it, a mini flashlight, the same ring from that night. I almost couldn't believe I was holding it again. The only time I ever saw him take it off was when he proposed. I was shocked that they weren't going to bury him wearing it, but couldn't think of a polite way to say, "You give that back." How could I say this to his mother, whom I'd only just met? I made eyes at his ex-girlfriend, Lisa, whom he had dated for years after we broke up, and we went to sit in the corner together, conspiratorially, like girls at a dance. Lisa was petite and funny and charismatic, someone I'd become fast friends with if only I had met her under other circumstances. "Don't you think he should be buried in the ring?" I whispered. She nodded. Then she said, "But you know, he wouldn't have wanted to be buried at all. Jason told me he wanted to be cremated." I didn't remember him ever telling me this, but it was also possible that he did, and I just forgot. I liked Lisa. I wanted to like her, but I was not ready to admit she might know anything about Jason that I did not. And what if she was wrong? Not wrong, but misremembering. "You're right," I told her. I had forgotten that, but he told me too. Then I excused myself and went to the kitchen to make myself a taco plate. Not only was I the only one who seemed hungry, but my hunger was embarrassingly insatiable. Food fast-forwarded time for me. First tacos, then bed, then the funeral, then I would fly home. I was scooping seconds onto my plate when Jason's grandmother and I started talking about his recent obsession with diet and exercise. I told her I remembered all the vitamins he took from a gallon-sized Ziploc bag when he stayed with me in Brooklyn. The last email Jason ever sent me was about research he had been doing on how antioxidant supplements could combat the daily accumulation of free radicals and prolong life. The last line of the email said, "Immortality ahoy, I'll let you be the judge." "I still have one of his fruit smoothies in the fridge," she said. The fridge was right behind her. My first thought was, can I see it? My second thought was, why do I want to see it? Because his mouth was on that straw, that's why I wanted to see it. And because his finger was wearing that ring until they removed it from his body. Because when I think of Jason, the first thing I always think of is his body. That night, for the last time, his body lay above ground. I could easily imagine him rising from his coffin and coming for us, demanding we return the ring before he'd go anywhere. I thought, he'll never let us live this down. Thank you so much.
It is a rare first novel that inspires neither annoyance nor jealousy in a reader, a story that has finally found the person who can tell it. This is what we got when Shobha decided to write An Unrestored Woman, which recounts the fallout of 1947 partition between India and Pakistan through the lives of victims of what is known as the largest peacetime migration in history. An Unrestored Woman is a novel of short stories, a perfect structure to house the beasts of diaspora, the many lives lived discreetly and sharing a single past as narrator. That these lives in the 70 years since partition are discreet is modernity to some and to others, tragedy. Shobha concentrates on exploited lives, particularly of women and children in Hindu and Muslim communities, but she does not rest on the easy point that a lack of parity does not imply absence of capacity. She commits herself to visualizing the complexities of personal and historical relationships in societies, including in the US today, where women are neither omitted nor relevant. The characters in this book are at once prurient and pious, queer and committed, each wrestling with the learned impulse that history is me and mine, and the flattening of difference that occurs in the shedding of blood. Beyond personal and historical, the relationship explored in this book is associative. Characters blend together with time with distance, and with Shobha's evocative prose, it feels as if you really could brush the shoulder of a woman and begin humming the song her mother sang in childhood. So the reactive is central in this book, and the chain of reactions that follow from the misheard, the misunderstood, the mistaken, the mistake, history. Shobha asks, in what ways are we the products of what we inherit, and equally in what ways are we not? Are we what has happened to us and our parents and to theirs, or are we how we react to what has happened? If we look only at the aboutness of this book, its moral is simple. The human being is first and foremost a fucked up thing to be. But this book is affirmative because this book is beautiful. Shobha, in her intelligence and grace, is a beacon for women and for all children of diaspora, but as a writer, she is a poet, making her work that rare light that both beckons and illuminates. We read her work to see where our own shadows fall. Shobha is the recipient of a Catherine Ann Porter Prize, an Elizabeth George Foundation Fellowship, and a Hedgebrook residency. A selection from An Unrestored Woman appears in the 2015 Best American Short Stories. Please welcome my great friend, Shobha Rao.
Thank you, Rachel, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the Montana Book Festival for having me here. It is such an honor to be on the stage. I am going to read an excerpt from a short story called Blindfold. And there's no background because it's not the companion story, it's actually the initial story. So it is called Blindfold. Bandra wasn't in the market for a girl, but when she saw Zubaydah, she knew, even with a girl so young, that she would grow up to be beautiful. She had an eye for these things. She asked the driver of the horse cart to stop. "Where are we?" she yelled up to him. "Dharanpur," he said. Bandra stepped out of the cart. The village of Dharanpur was small, just a sprinkling of low, unadorned huts. Farmers and shepherds, Bandra thought. And then she thought, impoverished. She moved closer to Zubaydah to get a better look. The girl was hardly 4 or 5 years old. She took no notice of Bandra. She was busy collecting firewood, kindling really, which is all her tiny hands could manage. But she was determined. She broke off branches from trees, the lower ones, the ones she could reach. She scoured the ground for stray pieces. She had a basket tied to her back in which she carefully placed each piece of wood. Bandra watched her with interest and then turned to look for a mother or a sister. There was no one in sight. When she turned back, Bandra gasped. The girl had picked up a stick with something hanging, something moving. It took a moment, but then Bandra saw it. A snake. She nearly yelled out, ran to her, but before she could, Zubaydah calmly picked up the snake behind its head, gray with a brown threaded pattern to its scales, and held it. Its body coiled, its mouth yawned open, hinged and menacing, its head angled upward. Bandra thought she would fling it away, but instead, the girl turned the snake around to face her and opened her own mouth wide. What was she doing? Bandra held her breath. Around them was a stillness, a quiet. Bandra heard the whine of mosquitoes. She's challenging it, Bandra realized slowly. She's challenging a snake. After a moment, there came a shout from one of the huts to hurry up and bring the wood. And when the girl heard it, she tossed the snake into a nearby bush and hurried off toward the village. Bandra watched her, and it was then that she decided she wanted her for the brothel. Bandra gave the girl's father a silver coin to hold her, a down payment of sorts, with a guarantee that he would sell to Bandra when the girl was older. 11 was agreed upon age. 4 silver coins was agreed upon price. Bandra was 30 years old, or so she guessed. Her mother had told her that she was born the year of some great Indian mutiny against the British. That was in 1857 or maybe 1856, and would put her at 30 or 31. It didn't matter. She was worn out. She'd been married to her husband when she was 12. He had been 39. He'd owned a small plot of land inherited from his father, but his true wealth had been in the trade of gur, which is an unrefined sugar, which was sent swaying on the backs of donkeys across the Spinker, through the Khyber Pass, and into Afghanistan. It had been lucrative, but he'd gambled it all away, all of it. So that when he died 10 years ago, he'd left her the plot of flat, useless land, a mountain of debt, and 3 young children. She'd stood in the center of this plot of land and had known it could grow nothing, not even a shriveled sprig of cilantro. And so she'd sold everything, her modest piece of jewelry, all the furniture in the house, the livestock, and even her hair, and used the money to build a brothel and buy her first 3 girls. Her brothel was a simple affair tucked into the outskirts of Peshawar outside the walled city. It was a collection of 6 mud huts surrounding a central courtyard. Bandra's was the 7th and the biggest hut. Hers actually had a wooden almirah, windows, multiple rooms, and 2 doors, one that opened into the courtyard and one that led into the street. The other huts had only 1 door facing the courtyard, so that the girls had to pass through Bandra's hut to leave the compound, though what reason was there for them to leave? Bandra provided all the food, clothing, and sundries they needed. In fact, they were so fond of her, they called her Bandra Ma. Bandra was especially proud of this, that they felt close enough to call her Ma. There was, of course, times when one or another of them needed a good beating, or she would have to force feed one of the girls for a few days. The poor things sometimes got into their heads that starving themselves would allow them to leave the compound. That was not so. Bandra recalled the death of that one sweet girl. What was her name? But that was long ago, and her family, when they'd been told, had merely shrugged. 7 years passed. Bandra appeared again in Dharanpur at the door of Zubayda's parents. The father came in from his sheep late that night, and Bandra was waiting inside, sipping a cup of tea. The father, named Abdul Shahid, stopped in his tracks when he saw her. There were other children in the house, but Zubayda was nowhere in sight. "Where is she?" Bandra asked, her voice even. "Who?" "Your daughter, the one I bought." "I don't know, she's run off." Bandra smiled. "If that were true," she said, "I would have known about it the week before she left." That's how close my ears are to the ground. Now, where is she? Abdul Shahid shuffled his feet and finally entered his house. "Tea," he called out to his wife. After a moment, he said, "We don't want to sell." He went to a satchel that was hidden between a pile of blankets. He undid a knot and held out a handful of coins. "Here is your money with interest." Bandra looked at the coins. She needed a new girl. She was down to 4. Her customers had been dwindling. Besides, a deal was a deal. "You know what's most interesting about a beautiful girl?" she asked the father. He stared at her. "It's that you can't keep her hidden for long." Bandra knocked the coins out of his hand. "Find her," she said. "No." Bandra grew suddenly tired. She recalls Zubayda as she'd last seen her, a little girl, hurrying home unaware of the danger she'd so easily held in her tiny hands. Bandra looked at the father and sighed. She was tired of the cowardice, the utter weakness of men. She got up to leave. "What will you do?" the father asked, a slight trembling entering his voice. "I'm going to recover my investment," she said. "But I'm returning your money." "I don't want the money, Abdul Shahid. I want the girl." He let go of the satchel and lunged toward her, but Bandra was by the door and slipped past him. She was at the boundary of his parched, pitiable land when he called out, "I'll go to the Malik." "Go ahead," she said, "and give him my regards. He's my uncle." It took Bandra less than a fortnight to find her. She was in the tehsil of Charsada at the home of a distant maternal uncle. She knew her at once. And she had to laugh. Zubaydah was playing outside when she arrived. Bandar simply walked up to her, grabbed her by the hair, and dragged her into the waiting donkey cart. Zubaydah screamed, and a few women and small children came to the door, but no one helped her. See, Bandar thought, women have more sense. Still, it was difficult getting Zubaydah into the cart. She kicked and punched and pulled. She bit. At one point, in the 20 steps it took to reach the donkey cart, Zubaydah yanked so hard that she left Bandra holding only a tuft of hair. She ran as fast as a tiny panther, and Bandra had to tackle her from behind and pin her to the ground before she stopped squirming. When she finally got her into the cart, Bandar tied her hands and feet together with one long piece of rope, then bound that rope around her own waist. She stuffed a cloth into Zubaydah's mouth. She waited a few minutes till she got her breath back. Then Bandra looked at her new purchase. The girl's hair was in disarray. There were cuts and bruises on her arms and face, with a substantial gash on her cheek. Her clothes were ripped. She tugged at the rope around her feet and wrists, bellowed against the cloth in her mouth, shot daggers at Bandar with her eyes. But Bandar had to smile because she had been right. Zubaydah was indeed beautiful. When they arrived at the compound, Gulshan was waiting for them. She was not Bandar's favorite, but she had been here the longest, since she was 8. Now she was 14. The men liked her well enough. She had the eyes and the lips of a child. But she lacked something. Maybe it was sense, Bandar sometimes thought, or maybe it was daring. She had some regulars because they could do with her what they wanted. She was compliant. Her utter obedience was not at all surprising. Bandar had found her dirty and covered in lice in a hovel in Wazirbagh. Her father had beaten her every day, and there had been so little food in the family that when Bandar had given her her first meal in the brothel of dry roti and a bit of dal, Gulshan had fallen to her knees and wept. Bandar Ma, Gulshan began as soon as they entered the courtyard. Sadiqa started her monthly during, and now the customer refuses to leave. He wants his money back. Where is he? In the sitting room. The sitting room was in Bandar's hut where the customers entered and paid. She's early, Bandar said, to no one in particular. Then she looked at Zubaydah. She just stood there, blinking, the cloth still stuffed into her mouth, her wrists and ankles still bound. She untied the rope at her waist. Take her to the green door, she told Gulshan. It wasn't really a door, just a curtain, but each girl had a different color. Gulshan's was red, Sadiqa's was blue, and Zubaydah's would be green. There were, of course, wooden doors behind the curtains, but the colors made it easier for the customers. Bandar watched her hop away, being led by Gulshan. How odd, she thought, that she was so suddenly docile. It was surprising, but it always came, eventually. The acceptance that this would be their life, and that whatever had come before was of no consequence. The love of a mother, the cradle of a lap, the laughter of siblings, the one cup of evening tea passed from hand to hand, the long and wistful evenings watching a far horizon. To this end, Bandar had insisted when the compound was built that none of their rooms have windows. Bandar let a few days pass. Zubaydah's cuts and bruises needed to heal. The men, they wanted to be the ones to make them. She fed her well. 2 rotis a day, plenty of dal, the choicest pieces of mutton. She was a little on the thin side, which is typical of girls from the countryside, but with each passing day, Zubaydah grew plumper. Her skin regained its flawlessness. Her hair, oiled and combed, shone like moonlight. It was her docility that bothered Bandra. She didn't trust it. It was too complete. Another thing, she refused to call her Bandrama. In fact, she didn't call her anything. She hardly spoke. She never actually addressed Bandra or any of the other girls directly. She whispered every now and then, and only with Gulshan. "What does she say to you?" Bandra asks. She asks questions. Like what? Like, why are we here? Why don't we have windows? Why did the lady buy me? Why can't we go outside? Things like that. Bandar smiled and said nothing. After 2 weeks, she dressed Zubaydah in various colors until she found the right ones. Pink was her color. She drew a thick line of kohl around her eyes and painted her skin with henna. Bandar stood back. The blouse was low, cut, but not overly revealing. The girl had small breasts, no larger than a baby chiku, but that made no difference. Men liked the suggestion of childhood. She grabbed Zubaydah by the chin, hoisted her face up to meet her eyes, and said, "Your name is now Layla. Don't forget." Then she sent for her oldest and most regular customer, Abdul Karim. He was 48, a well-to-do wheat merchant, and he had paid extra for the Virgin. When he came in, she could see the lust dancing in his eyes. "What's her name?" he asked. "Layla." "Ah," he sighed, just like in the lover's tale. "Yes," Bandar said, "just like that." She hadn't told Layla what to expect. It was better not to. She waited outside, as she always did with the new girls. At first, she heard tussling. Later, there were screams, the girls, followed by low grunts, then a loud thump before it went quiet. When Abdul Karim came out of her room, he and Bandar went straight to her sitting room. "Feisty," he said. Then he smiled. Bandar looked at his face and saw scratches on his neck and chin. He showed her a bite mark on his arm. Bandar was apologetic. But Abdul Karim said, oh no, you should charge extra." After that, the stream of customers for Layla was steady, 6, 7 a day. Bandar watched her carefully. She was still obedient, eating only what was given her, speaking only with Gulshan, but on some mornings, Bandar noticed that her eyes were red. She once spied mysterious burn marks on her ankle. One evening, she handed her a knife, the curved one attached to a flat wooden base to cut vegetables, and Layla reached for it, and then she stared at it. A knife. And then, for the first time, Layla smiled. Thank you.
Is everybody okay? Okay. Let's set the reset button, okay? All right. Here are some basic facts and figures. First, Maile Meloy is the author of 3 novels, 2 books of short stories, and a series of 3 young adult novels. And no, it is not pronounced Meile. She's a New York Times bestselling author who has won the Paris Review's Aga Khan Prize for Fiction, the PEN Malamud Award for Excellence in the Short Story, the Rosenthal Foundation Award for the American Academy of Arts and Letters, 2 California Book Awards, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, Slate, Sunset, and O Magazine. She's also done what many have said is absolutely impossible. She has had her short stories optioned and made into a major motion picture, starring people you've actually heard of. Certain Women comes out next month, and you can see a screening of it here in Missoula on Friday, October 7th at the Roxy. I'll be there. Most importantly, in the winter of 2010, I very badly burned my hand with hot oil. Meloy's book of short fiction, both ways is the only way I want it, and a bag of frozen pearl onions were the only two reasons that I made it through that night. I am so excited that she is here and that we get to hear her read her words. Here's Maile Meloy.
Hi. Thank you for coming. I love being here. I love being home. This is a chapter from a very new novel. It's coming out in June. I'm just finishing it. It's about two families who go on a cruise that's supposed to go from LA down the coast of Mexico to Panama and back north again. And they go ashore in Central America, and a series of small things go wrong. And they end up at a beach at a mouth of a river, and it seems very safe, and the kids are playing on inner tubes. The kids are Penny, who's 11 and very opinionated, and her little brother Sebastian, who is 8 and sweet and has diabetes, and their cousins Marcus, who's also 11, and his sister June, who is 6. And they've met an Argentinian family on the ship, and those kids are older. Hector is 15 and Isabel is 14. You don't have to remember any of that, but just that's what sets it up. And until this chapter, we've seen things mostly from the parents' point of view, but I'm going to pick up with the kids. So this is chapter 6. The kids were engrossed in a complicated game with the 3 inner tubes, making a kind of pyramid they could stand on. It required a great deal of concentration. Hector, who was the oldest, was the master of the game, and he kept everyone involved. He didn't leave the little ones out or cut them any slack. Penny admired that in him. Every few minutes, someone would slip or step in the wrong place, and everyone would go crashing into the water, screaming with delight, the inner tubes flying. Hector would make sure everyone was safe and afloat, and then they would start rebuilding. They were so focused that they didn't notice when the tide changed. It must have paused when they were first in the water, then it reversed and began to flow inland. No one noticed that the water from the sea was pushing them upstream, slowly at first, and then with surprising force. When they finally looked up, waterlogged, each with an arm slung over a tube and legs treading the silty water, they were in a different place. There was no beach. There were no mothers on towels. The river was starting to narrow. It was overhung with trees. Penny squinted against the sun. She was hanging on to an inner tube with Isabel and had one arm over the smaller tube June and Sebastian were on. Her fingertips were pruned. She felt her little brother's arm slide against hers. Hector and Marcus were on the third tube. Birds sang and insects buzzed in the trees, but there were no human sounds. "What do we do?" she asked. They all looked to Hector, their leader. He frowned. Then he said, "We hold on and kick back." He rolled his long body over and started to kick. They tried, all 6 of them, to propel themselves back toward the beach, but it was pointless. The tidal current was too strong. The little ones spluttered, water in their faces. "Stop," Hector commanded. The song of insects and birds returned. On they floated with the muscle of the river. "Will they come find us?" Sebastian asked in a small voice. "Of course they will," Penny said. And really, what was keeping them? The jungle on the bank looked impenetrable, but their mothers would find a way. "We should shout," she said. Together they cried, "Mom! Mommy!" in one shrill, beseeching voice. Then they stopped, as if with the swipe of a conductor's wand, and waited in the silence. There was no response. The river swirled around them. "I have to pee," June said. "Just go in the water," her brother said. "I can't." "Why not?" "I just can't. What about those fish that swim up the pee inside you?" "That's in the Amazon," Marcus said. "Why couldn't they be here?" June asked. "Because the Amazon doesn't connect to here," he said. Penny already had peed. and she hoped those fish really weren't in the water. On the left bank, there was a tiny sloping place. They all kicked to it and clambered out. It felt good to be on solid ground. As soon as they stood, it seemed clear that they should wait here rather than traveling ever farther away from their mothers. It had been smart to get out. Penny helped June find a place to peel down her wet bathing suit behind a tree. The trees were like something out of fairy tales, thick, twisted, hung with vines. June peed into the damp ground, looking up at Penny. "Are you scared, Penny?" she asked. "Nope," Penny lied. "Because they're going to find us?" "Yes," Penny said. She helped June pull up her swimsuit straps and felt very grown up. Isabel might be the oldest girl, but Penny was the one June knew and trusted. "I'm hungry," June said. "We can go back to the buffet on the ship," Penny said, "when they find us." They rejoined the group, and Hector announced, "I'm going to swim back." "You can't swim against the river," Marcus said. "I can," he said, "if I stay to the sides, where the water goes the other direction." Penny had been whitewater rafting with her grandparents. "You mean in the eddies," she said. Isabel said something protesting in Spanish. "I'll come back for you," Hector told her. Then he waded out, lowered his body in near the bank, and started swimming. He was very strong. His arms slashed through the water. They watched in silence as he disappeared around a bend. "What if he doesn't come back?" Marcus asked. "He'll come back," Isabel said. "We should be on the other side of the river," Marcus said. "We can't get up that bank," Penny said. They studied the other side of the river and the steep mud bank, assessing it. And then the bank moved. At least it seemed to move. There were tangled roots, and a section of the mottled mud was sliding. "Oh," Penny said. Isabel said something under her breath. It was not mudsliding, but an enormous crocodile sunning itself on the bank. It had moved its big, sinister head, split by a row of teeth, but now it settled again, motionless. Isabel put a hand over her mouth. "Hector will be okay," Marcus said. The little ones weren't paying attention. They had started making a small mud castle in the soft ground. Penny imagined her mother picking her way through the trees on the opposite bank and coming across that monster. They had to get back before that happened. But there was no reason crocodiles wouldn't be on this side of the river, too. She stepped backward. She wanted to get away from the water, away from the muddy banks. In the trees behind them, they heard an engine noise and turned. "There's a road," Penny said. She started toward it. "We have to stay here," Isabel said, "and wait for Hector." "We should find the road," Penny said. They looked at each other. A battle of wills. Penny had read the phrase in books and knew this was what it meant. Isabel was older, but Penny was smarter. She could not say in front of the little ones that they might be eaten by a crocodile if they stayed here, but she beamed the argument into Isabel's eyes. "I'm hungry," Sebastian said. "Me too," June said. Penny thought of how her mother would panic when she saw they were gone. Sebastian needed food or his blood sugar might drop, but he also needed insulin or his blood sugar would go too high, and he didn't have his pump. Marcus said they should hang the inner tubes on a branch to show where they had left the river. Isabel clearly wasn't happy about the plan, but she didn't want to stay alone, so the five of them set off into the dense forest. The crocodile on the other bank still hadn't moved. Hector would be fine, Penny told herself. There was no trail, and it was painful climbing barefoot over roots and fallen trees. Beneath the undergrowth, things scuttled away. Penny saw ants marching in a column, carrying green pieces of leaves over their heads like sails. She took Sebastian's hand, a thing he would not usually tolerate. They stumbled out into a clearing where a jeep was parked. Two men sat on the ground, drinking bottles of Coke. They stared as if the children were fairies, materialized from the woods. "Say something Spanish," Penny whispered to Isabel. "No," Isabel whispered back. "Hola," Penny called. The men just stared. There was a shovel on the ground, and their clothes were dirty. "Can I have a Coke?" Sebastian whispered to Penny. The door of the Jeep opened and a woman got out. She had strong brown arms and she wore a beige tank top and cargo pants. Penny thought that she looked like the girl action figure that goes with the toy Jeep. The woman asked a question in too fast Spanish, but Isabel didn't answer. Penny said, "We're Americans." That seemed important to say. "How long you stand here?" the woman asked in English. "We just got here," Penny said. "We walked from the river." "Why?" "We were looking for a road." "Is no road," the woman said. "We heard an engine," Penny said, looking pointedly at the Jeep. "Where are your parents?" "At the big beach down the river," Penny said. "We came from the ship, the big ship. We were swimming. Mi hermano es diabético." She'd been taught that sentence before they left, for emergencies. Sebastian leaned into her. "Can I have a Coke?" he asked. The woman in the tank top frowned, then reached into the Jeep and brought out a bottle. She twisted off the top. Sebastian ran forward to grab it, then ran back to Penny's side and drank. She wished her mother were here. If Sebastian was low, the Coke would be good, but if he was high, it could make him feel worse. "Will you give us a ride?" she asked the woman. They were not supposed to get in cars with strangers, but there were 5 of them, and they were asking for a ride. That seemed to make it safer. And the driver was a woman. You were supposed to ask a woman for help if you got in trouble, preferably a mother, but this was who they had. And maybe she was a mother, although Penny doubted it. "Okay," the woman said, waving toward the Jeep. Penny and Sebastian got in front together. Isabel looked toward the river and seemed like she might run, but then got in the back seat with Marcus and June. The 2 men with the shovel crouched in the cargo area behind them. The woman reversed the Jeep. Penny buckled the seatbelt over herself and over Sebastian's bare chest. "Are you okay?" she asked him. "I'm a little sleepy," he said. "You should stay awake." "Okay," he said. His blonde hair was limp and damp on his forehead. Penny pushed it off his face. "I have to poop," June said in the back seat. "Hold it," her brother said. Penny looked back and saw June with her hands clamped on the crotch of her blue swimsuit, Marcus looking anxious beside her. When Penny looked out the windshield again, they didn't seem to be going in the right direction. "We're going back to that beach, right?" she asked. The woman nodded. "I don't think this is the right way," Penny said. "We call them," the woman said. "Their cell phones don't work here." "We call the ship," the woman said. "But they aren't at the ship." The Jeep was driving down a paved road among trees. Would her parents have gone back to the ship? "I really have to poop," June said. "Keep holding it," her brother said. "I am!" The Jeep was climbing a mountain, and a few houses appeared on the side of the road. The road wound and twisted, and then a man on a tall white horse was riding toward them. The Jeep slowed. Penny thought she might be imagining the horse. It was so white and bright. But then June whispered, "He's beautiful." And Penny knew that the others could see it too. The Jeep stopped, and the man on the horse looked down at them. He had dark, frowning eyebrows, and he spoke with the woman in Spanish. Penny looked to Isabel in the back seat for a translation, but Isabel ducked her chin toward her yellow bikini as if trying not to be seen. The man on the horse smiled. His teeth were white and straight. "Welcome," he said. The horse snorted. It had soft nostrils, gray and pink. "We need insulin," Penny told the man. She felt blinded by embarrassment and confusion, the heat rising to her face. "My brother is diabetico. Also, we need a bathroom." "I have to poop," June said. The man looked at them all for a minute. "Okay, let's go," he said, wheeling the horse around, and the Jeep started up the mountain again. Thank you. Is someone else coming up here, or am I saying goodnight to all of you? I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you for supporting your independent bookstores. The last time I read from something new, everyone came up afterward and said, where can we buy that book? And it didn't exist yet. But it was The Apothecary, which they have here, I think, if you have a 9 to 12-year-old in your life. And they have wonderful books by these wonderful people here. And I think everyone's happy to ask questions, right? If you come out there, is that true? To answer questions. Thank you. I love seeing you all. Good night.